40 kilometers east of Mexico City, there is a stretch of ground where the earth itself refuses to stay still. It is the bed of a dead lake, soft gray clay, 60 meters deep in places, so unstable that anything heavy placed on it begins to sink within months. In 2014, the Mexican government looked at this ground and announced it would build the largest airport in the Americas on top of it. 6 runways, a terminal under a single roof, bigger than any other on Earth. A design signed by one of the most famous architects alive. Construction began. Foundations were poured. $5 billion were spent. And then Mexico held a vote. 4 days of voting, in which roughly 1% of the country's electorate took part. When the count was done, the airport, 1/3 built, billions already in the ground, was cancelled. Not paused, not redesigned, demolished, dismantled, and deliberately flooded. Today, where the great terminal was supposed to stand, there is water, grass, and birds. This is the story of Texcoco. The place's power forgot. To understand why anyone would build an airport on a dead lake, you have to start with the lake itself, because the lake explains everything about this story, including how it ends. Mexico City should not exist where it does. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, they found the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, built on an island in the middle of a vast shallow lake called Texcoco. After the conquest, the Spanish did something no one had attempted on that scale before. They decided to drain the lake, not part of it, all of it. The draining took centuries, canals, tunnels, pumps, and it left behind one of the strangest foundations any major city has ever stood on. 22 million people now live on a plateau of lakebed clay that compresses under weight like a wet sponge. Parts of Mexico City sink by dozens of centimeters every year. Buildings lean. Pipes shear. The cathedral in the main square has been sinking, unevenly, for 400 years. And on the eastern edge of the city, the last remnant of the old lake, the dried, salt-crusted, mostly empty bed of Lake Texcoco, sat undeveloped. Too soft to build on, too salty to farm. A blank space on the map of one of the largest cities in the world. By the early 2000s, Mexico City had a problem that blank space seemed to solve. Its airport, Benito Juárez International, was choking. Built decades earlier and swallowed by the growing city around it. It had 2 runways standing so close together that planes could not take off and land on both at the same time. It was designed to handle around 32 million passengers a year. By the middle of the 2010s, it was handling well over 40 million. There was no room to expand. The city had surrounded it completely. The congestion was not an abstraction. Benito Juárez had become one of the most slot-restricted airports in the hemisphere. Airlines that wanted to fly to Mexico City, the largest metropolitan economy in Latin America, were being turned away for lack of runway time. Delays cascaded through the national network, because nearly every route in the country touched the capital. Economists put a number on it every year. Hundreds of millions of dollars in lost connectivity, lost cargo, lost growth. The city that anchored a country of 120 million people was running on aviation infrastructure from another era. And everyone who governed it knew. Every Mexican government for a generation had known a new airport was needed. President Vicente Fox had already tried to build it at Texcoco in 2001, and his attempt became a national trauma. His government decreed the expropriation of farmland around the town of San Salvador Atenco on the lake's edge, offering the farmers compensation of around 7 pesos per square meter, less than the price of a sandwich, for land their families had worked for generations. The farmers refused. They marched on the highways with machetes. They took police officers hostage. They blockaded their towns and held them. After months of escalating confrontation, in August 2002, the government surrendered completely and canceled the project. The lesson every Mexican politician took from Atenco was simple. The airport question was not an engineering problem. It was political dynamite. The project went into a drawer for 12 years. In September 2014, President Enrique Peña Nieto took it out again. He announced it on national television, with renderings glowing behind him. The new international airport of Mexico, Nuevo Aeropuerto Internacional de Mexico. It would be built on the federally owned lakebed at Texcoco, which meant, this time, no farmers to expropriate. It would replace Benito Juárez entirely. And it would not be a modest, sensible piece of infrastructure. It would be a statement proof that Mexico could build at the level of Dubai, of Beijing, of the great hub airports of the 21st century. The ambition was not capacity. The ambition was prestige. The design alone told you what kind of project this was meant to be. The government commissioned Norman Foster, the British architect behind Beijing's airport terminal and the Reichstag Dome in Berlin, working together with Fernando Romero, one of Mexico's most prominent architects, who happened to be the son-in-law of Carlos Slim, then one of the 2 or 3 richest men on the planet. Keep that name in mind. It comes back. What Foster and Romero drew was extraordinary. A single terminal in the shape of a giant X, stretching across the lakebed, around 740,000 square meters under one continuous roof. At the time, it was described as the largest airport terminal in the world under a single span. The roof itself was the engineering signature, a lightweight lattice shell of steel and glass, curving like a membrane, with no conventional columns interrupting the space below. From the air, it would have looked like an enormous pale flower opening on the floor of the dead lake. The X shape was not decoration. It allowed every gate to sit close to the central spine, shortening walking distances in a building that would otherwise have required internal trains. The roof was designed to harvest its own rainwater and shade its own halls, and the whole structure was engineered to be light, radically light, because every ton saved was a ton the lakebed would not have to carry. Foster's office spoke about it the way architects speak about cathedrals. It was meant to be, in their words, an airport unlike any other built before. The numbers matched the imagery. 6 runways at full build-out. Benito Juárez had 2, capacity for 125 million passengers a year when complete, which would have placed it among the largest airports on Earth, above Atlanta, above Heathrow. The first phase alone, 3 runways and the X-shaped terminal, was designed to handle nearly 70 million. This site covered more than 4,400 hectares of lakebed, an area larger than many cities the airport would have served. The official budget started at around $13 billion. Within 3 years, the estimate had grown toward 15, and independent analysts suspected it would go higher. Mega projects on soft ground always do. The money itself was an engineering project of its own, rather than fund the airport purely from the federal budget. The government built a financial structure around the passenger fees of the existing airport. Every traveler passing through Benito Juárez was already paying a usage charge, and those charges, present and future, were pledged to investors as collateral. $6 billion in bonds were sold on international market. A further multi-billion-dollar instrument was floated on the Mexican stock exchange. The logic was elegant and circular. The old airport's passengers would pay for the new airport, which would then inherit those same passengers and keep paying the debt. The structure had one assumption buried at its core, that the airport would exist. Because the ground was the real adversary. Everything else about the project, the architecture, the financing, the politics, was negotiable. The clay was not the bed of Lake Texcoco as one of the worst places on the planet to build something heavy. The clay is up to 60 meters deep, saturated with water, and it compresses relentlessly under load. Engineers measured the ground at the site sinking even before construction started. The whole eastern basin subsides on its own as the city's wells pull water out of the aquifer beneath it. A conventional runway built there would warp and crack within years. A conventional terminal would tear itself apart, so the engineering became as ambitious as the architecture. The runways were designed essentially to float, resting on the clay rather than anchoring through it, built over layers of compacted basalt and geotextile, with the expectation that they would settle slowly and evenly and be releveled over decades. Millions of prefabricated vertical drains were driven into the lakebed, slender wicks pushed deep into the clay to wring the water out of it and pre-shrink the ground before anything was built on top. Engineers piled enormous temporary loads of rock onto the future runways, deliberately crushing the clay in advance, then carting the rock away once the ground had given up its settlement. It was construction by patience, squeezing a lake out of the soil, hectare by hectare. The logistics reshaped the landscape far beyond the site. Mountains were quarried for rock fill. Entire hillsides in the surrounding states were eaten away to feed the lakebed. At the peak of the work, the project consumed stone faster than almost any construction site in the hemisphere. Thousands of trucks rolled across the basin every day, and tens of thousands of workers passed through the gates. There was also a quieter engineering war underneath it all. The lake bed was not just soft ground, it was the safety valve of the entire valley's drainage system, the place where floodwaters had always been allowed to pool. Building there meant rerouting the stormwaters of a megacity. New channels, new regulation lagoons, a redesign of the basin's hydraulics that most of the public never saw and never heard about. By 2018, the work was visibly real. The great foundation slab of the terminal was in place. The skeleton of the X had begun to rise, tens of thousands of tons of specially fabricated steel, some of it among the largest structural pieces ever forged for a Mexican project. 2 runways were substantially advanced. Around a third of the entire project was complete, and roughly $5 billion had already been spent. And here the story stops being about engineering, because while the terminal was rising out of the clay, something else was rising with it: suspicion. In the Mexico of the 2010s, a $13 billion project announced by President Peña Nieto carried a smell that no rendering could cover. His administration was drowning in corruption scandals, including one involving his own house, built for him by a government contractor. And the airport's contracts flowed with remarkable consistency toward a familiar constellation of companies. Firms connected to Carlos Slim, whose son-in-law had co-designed the terminal, the country's politically wired construction giants, the same names that always appeared wherever public money pooled. None of this was proven, in court, to be corrupt. It did not need to be. To millions of Mexicans, the airport stopped being a piece of infrastructure and became a symbol, a monument that the political class was building to itself, on a foundation of debt, in the bed of a dead lake. One politician understood this better than anyone. His name was Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and he had been running for president, in one form or another, for 12 years. He called the airport a capricho, a whim, a pharaonic vanity project. He said it was corrupt, that it was sinking, that the money belonged to the poor. And he made a promise that most of the country's establishment found absurd: if he won, the airport would not be finished. In July 2018, he won the presidency in a landslide, 53% of the vote, the largest margin in modern Mexican history. The airport was 1/3 built. Its new owner had promised to kill it. What happened next had almost no precedent anywhere in the world. López Obrador would not take office until December 1, 2018. He was, through October and November, a president-elect with no constitutional power at all. The airport's cranes were still moving. The bonds were still trading. The government that had started the project was still legally in charge of it. Through the autumn of 2018, the country's business establishment tried everything to save the project. Engineers published open letters. Banks modeled the cost of cancellation. Some proposed privatizing the airport entirely, taking it off the government's books, anything to keep the cranes moving. López Obrador listened politely and then did something none of them had modeled. In late October 2018, 5 weeks before taking power, his team organized what they called a public consultation, a referendum in effect on the airport, run not by the National Electoral Authority, but by his own movement and a sympathetic foundation, with ballot tables set up in plazas around the country. 4 days of voting, in fewer than a third of the country's municipalities. The question: continue at Texcoco or cancel it and build 2 new runways at a military airbase called Santa Lucia instead. Roughly 1 million people voted. In a country of nearly 90 million eligible voters, that is about 1%. There were photographs of people voting more than once at different tables. There was no independent verification of the count. Most of the ballot tables were concentrated in regions that supported him. Just under 70% voted to cancel. On October 29, 2018, López Obrador stood before the cameras and declared the matter settled. The people had spoken. The airport at Texcoco would not be finished. The peso fell within minutes. The Mexican stock exchange dropped. The bondholders, $6 billion of them, discovered that the asset backing their investment was scheduled to stop existing. What followed was one of the strangest negotiations in the history of infrastructure finance, a government offering to buy back the debt of an airport it was choosing to destroy. Nearly $2 billion of bonds were repurchased. The remaining bondholders kept their claim on the passenger fees of the old airport, meaning that, to this day, travelers passing through Benito Juárez are still paying charges that service the debt of a terminal that was demolished. Contractors were compensated. Insurance was settled. Enormous sums of public money were spent, line by line, to unbuild a public work. It is worth pausing on what was actually cancelled. Not a drawing, not a proposal. a construction site where $5 billion had already been converted into concrete, steel, and drained clay. The foundation slab of the largest terminal roof ever designed was lying in the lakebed, finished. The steel of the X was standing against the sky. All of it now had to come down. The dismantling took years and was carried out with a strange, quiet thoroughness. The steel skeleton, tens of thousands of tons, much of it custom fabricated for a roof that would never exist, was cut apart and sold, much of it as scrap. Some of it was repurposed by the army for other projects. The vast foundation slab was too massive to remove, so it was simply abandoned where it lay. And then the engineers did the one thing the entire history of Mexico City had been organized against. They let the water come back. The drains were stopped. The basins were allowed to fill. Rain and runoff, which for decades had been pumped away from the lakebed as fast as possible, were allowed to pool across the site. The foundations of the terminal that was meant to receive 125 million passengers a year disappeared deliberately under a shallow sheet of water, the returning ghost of Lake Texcoco. In March 2022, the government made it official. The site was decreed a protected natural area, the Lake Texcoco Ecological Park, more than 14,000 hectares of restored wetland and grassland, an area roughly the size of 40 central parks, one of the largest urban ecological reserves in the world. The architect placed in charge of it, Iñaki Echeverría, had spent years arguing before the airport was ever cancelled, that the lakebed should never have been built on at all, that it was the valley's last lung and its last flood reserve. Now he was given the ruins to work with. Sections of the airport's own infrastructure were absorbed into the park. Access roads became trails, drainage works became wetland cells, and somewhere beneath the new lagoons, the terminal's foundation slab serves as the floor of a marsh. The birds arrived almost immediately. In the tens of thousands, ducks, herons, pelicans, shorebirds dropping out of the central flyway onto water that had not existed a few years earlier. Counts at the restored wetlands ran into the hundreds of thousands of individual birds within a couple of winters. The very creatures every airport on Earth spends fortunes trying to drive away now owned the site outright. The auditors, meanwhile, tried to count the cost. Mexico's Federal Audit Office initially calculated that canceling the airport had cost the country more than 300 billion pesos, on the order of $15 billion once every obligation was tallied. The government attacked the figure, and the auditors under pressure revised it sharply downward. No one disputes the floor. At least $5 billion spent on the construction itself, plus billions more in buybacks, compensation, and demolition, paid not to build something, but to make it never have existed. And the city still needed an airport. The replacement, Felipe Ángeles International, was built at the Santa Lucia Air Base, 40-some kilometers north of the city center, built not by the construction conglomerates of the old regime, but by the Army's Corps of Engineers, on time and on a budget of roughly $4 billion, and opened in March 2022, with the president cutting the ribbon on the same week the ecological park was decreed. It is clean, modern, and was for a long time conspicuously quiet. In its first months, it handled fewer passengers in a day than Benito Juárez handled in an hour. Airlines had to be pressured into moving flights there. Cargo carriers were eventually ordered out of the old airport by decree to give the new one traffic. The drive from central Mexico City can take well over an hour. Travelers compared terminals. One airport designed as a single sweeping roof by Norman Foster, drowned under a wetland, and one built by soldiers next to a military runway, open for business. Benito Juárez, the saturated old airport the Texcoco project was meant to retire, remains in service to this day, as crowded as ever, its two runways still too close together, sinking gently like everything else in the basin. The capacity problem that justified $13 billion of ambition in 2014 has not been solved. It has been distributed. There is a version of this story that is simple, and both sides in Mexico tell it. In one version, a corrupt elite tried to build a monument to itself, and the people stopped them. In the other, a populist destroyed the most important infrastructure project in the country's modern history to win an argument and called 1% of the electorate the people. But stand on the lakebed today, and a third version suggests itself. The Spanish spent 300 years draining Lake Texcoco. The engineers of the 20th century channeled it, pumped it, and paved it. The builders of the airport spent $5 billion teaching its clay to hold a roof the size of a small city. Every power that has ruled this valley for 5 centuries has tried to make the lake into ground. The lake is back. There are herons standing where the check-in halls were drawn. Under the water, a concrete slab the size of 700 football fields lies in the dark. The most expensive foundation ever built for nothing, and the ground it rests on continues, slowly, to sink. Power changed its mind here twice in 4 years. The lake only ever had one. The place's power forgot. If this story stayed with you, the next one is about a fortress city Portugal built on the far edge of its empire, and then